Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you part 2 of our two-part review of the Fujinon XF 90mm f2, and this is an R, which means it has an aperture ring. It is LM, linear motors, which is relevant to our discussion today, and then also it is WR, which means that it is weather sealed. And so in many ways, if you're comparing it to some of the other kind of medium telephoto, short telephoto, portrait options that are available on Fuji, it actually has some advantages because it's a newer, more modern design. And we really covered that a little bit more thoroughly in our first episode. And if you haven't seen that, I recommend that you take a look at it. In that episode, we talked about the build and the features and the handling. We also took a look at the image quality from the lens, and we'll do a little bit more dedicated look at portraits today as a part of our focus examination, but I recommend that you take a look at that if you want more specifics as to the actual optical properties of the lens. Now, as mentioned today, we're going to take a look at autofocus performance. We'll also take a little bit more of a look at video. As I mentioned, this has LM, which stands for linear motors, and in this case, it's actually a really robust quad linear motor focus system. So as a byproduct of that, focus is definitely both faster and quieter than what I saw on the 56mm f1.2, and really is right up there amongst some of the best that I have seen on Fuji, with the exception, of course, the XF 200mm f2 lens is exceptional in that regard. It's a really incredible focusing lens, but this certainly is a very, very competent focusing lens, and it has a lot greater focus speed and making focus changes, which makes it a little bit better for tracking action. So in many ways, the autofocus is very competent for a variety of different things, though with a few flaws that I want to point to. And so we're going to take a look at some photos together, and I'll give you some commentary on what to look for as a part of this, observations having used the lens for some time. Let's take a look. Okay, well, let's take a look at our quality of focus. So obviously depth of field is quite small with a lens like this, particularly when you're shooting at a fairly close distance and at maximum aperture. As you can see, however, autofocus has nailed it here, and we have a nice crisp looking result. Likewise here, this is a little bit of a challenging subject in that, what I wanted to focus on is quite narrow, and so, it can be easy for a focus system to kind of miss that and to grab a background instead. Now in this case, this particular image proved to be too much for the focus system, and try as I might to get a focus point on this branch hanging down, I was unable to do so. I had to manually focus this particular image to get what I was looking for, and as you can see, even my manual focus it's pretty close to perfect at the top, but since I was really focusing for this, let's be honest, I misfocused a little bit on that shot. Now, one thing that Fuji lacks right now is an equivalent to Sony's PET IAF. And so you can see in this particular shot, obviously my target was to get the dog's eye. You can see instead it grabbed the more prominent foreground object, which was the floppy ear here, which as you can see was full of burrs from her running through the little branches and shrubbery. And so anyway, that's an area where Fuji still needs to make some improvements to make it more intuitive when shooting non-human eye AF. Now, in more obvious situations, it does an excellent job. And so in this shot, obviously very, very shallow depth of field, you can see that the this metal portion that the rope is tied to along this dock, just a few inches beyond, it's completely out of focus. But you can see on the actual fibers of the rope, which is what I wanted to nail, you can see focus is excellent, and we have a highly blurred out background. When you're trying to focus on a prominent foreground object, but you might have some busyness in the background, it's quite reluctant to pull focus all the way back to the foreground object. And so in this case, I had to really, really work, try to restart, putting the focus point right on it, and it's still not wanting to focus back this far, and finally I was able to draw it back after multiple occasions. But it's often not intuitive. It wants to focus on the background instead of what you're trying to shoot in the foreground. Now, when it comes to shooting portraiture, a couple of things I want to point out. First of all, this particular shot is at 1/200th of a second, and so it you know, I was just kind of shocked to see any kind of evidence of motion blur. But remember that the X-T3 does have a fairly packed sensor. 26 megapixels is actually very high pixel density on an APS-C sensor like that. And so it's going to show off motion blur a bit more. And the lack of any kind of optical stabilizer, either in the lens or the camera, it resulted in there being some evident motion blur in the shot, even though, you know, shutter speed, I probably should have been safe on it. And obviously lighting was good. I have steady hands. And so I did notice that there were situations that I was disappointed to see some motion blur. And it was a reminder that I would have loved to have seen OSS in this lens, or, you know, IBIS in future bodies. The other thing though I do want to point out from this is that I found that, again, that the IAF is a little less sophisticated than either what I'm seeing from Sony, which is kind of the leader in this, but now Canon has really improved in their EOS R, and that it actually gets the eye and not the eyelash. In the case here of Fuji, I find that the focus is a little bit better on the lashes than it is on the eyes themselves. And so, you know, when you're looking at, you know, a collective kind of global level, focus looks fine. When you zoom in though, the eyes aren't as sharp as what they should be. You can see, like, from the teeth and the lips, this is a very sharp lens, but the eyes aren't as sharp as what I would like. Now in this case, the result is lovely, but I could not get the lens to focus. It was getting stuck on this mug being here, even though the eyes were clearly visible. And so I was really quite disappointed by that. And so I had to kind of force focus, you know, tweak it around. I think I actually had to do a little bit of manual focus to get the result that I wanted here, because the automatic focus did not, it got stuck on the foreground object. And frankly, this is a situation where I think that focus system should be sophisticated enough to not have that as a major obstacle. Now in this situation, you know, a little kind of simpler, more straightforward, depth of field is a little bit larger. We can see that, you know, our focus is just fine. IAF did fine. It looks really, really nice. It's a nice portrait lens. There's just a few situations, and here's another example here. You can see that the, just a little bit of hair obscuring part of the face. You can see here that even though we had IAF working, focus, the image is front focused, and so none of the eyes are really in perfect focus here. And so I was a little bit disappointed by that result under the circumstance. Now in our final series here, it's once again, you move back a little bit and focus becomes a little less critical, and so focus is fine here, though I wouldn't say that focus is necessarily exceptional, because the lens is sharp enough that I frankly expected a little bit better sharpness on this result here. It looks fine again from a global level, but up close, it's just not quite as nailed as what I've been seeing from Sony and Canon in similar situations on mirrorless. Another example here, and once again, it's kind of the same story. You can see that focus is adequate, but not exceptional. And I would say I'm seeing a little bit of front focus here, that it looks like it's sharp here on the shoulder, which is a little bit forward, and the face, not quite as sharp. Final thing I wanted to show you is the difference in bokeh with the lens stop down. So the difference between f2 and f4. And so you can see obviously circles are, you know, bigger and softer, as would be obvious. What you can also see is that the geometry is obviously more consistent with the lens stop down. But what you can also see is that even by f4, you can see some points on the aperture blades. You can see a shape that, while it's circular, it is not completely circular, and it starts to create the seven-sided figure that you see here. The overall look of the images, though, globally is nice. Let's take a look again at our focus. In this case, focus is pretty good. Looks like eye has been nailed here pretty well. And in our secondary image here, it's still pretty good, although it almost seems like it grabbed the far eye more than the closer eye, which is a little bit illogical in this kind of situation. That was set up with auto. They do have the option where you can select either or eye. I would have just liked to have seen a little more intuition on the focus there. Now, as I briefly alluded to there, several of the issues that I actually saw manifest during my review period, it's kind of hard to know what to attribute to the lens and what to attribute to the camera system. And in this case, I kind of suspect it's more on the camera system for the simple reason that as I'm looking ahead at some press releases from Fuji, I see that they have that firmware update that is scheduled for January of 2020. And I've noted that sometimes they're a little late in hitting those targets, but that's what's projected at the moment. And part of that firmware update, it specifically mentions having an issue, correcting an issue of, lenses struggling to focus, or focus system struggling to focus on foreground objects where there's a busy background. That certainly seems to describe some of what I saw. The other thing it mentions in there is fine-tuning Iaf Performance. And so what I think has happened here a bit is that while I found initially that Fuji's Iaf Performance was fairly good compared to, at the time, competitors from Sony, and not as good as Sony, obviously, even at that point. But then it actually was more competent in some ways than what Canon's mirrorless IAF was, and I don't know a lot about Nikon, but secondhand from what I'm hearing of Nikon's. What's happened, however, is that, as I mentioned, it's been a moving target. Both Sony and Canon have released firmware updates to their current bodies that have really improved, particularly Iaf Performance, giving it more of a real-time Iaf Performance, refining its activity. And so now they're both advanced a fair bit. And so as a result, because I'm using a Canon EOS R, I'm filming on one at the moment. I use, Sony A7R Mark III. I have a Sony A9. I've reviewed an A7 III, A7R IV, et cetera, et cetera. Even the A6400 is really quite competent when it comes to that real-time IAF. And so as a result, I'm seeing a little bit more of a divide from Fuji. Now, maybe they'll address that through their firmware update, and I certainly hope that they do. But at the moment, at least at the time I'm doing this review, there certainly is a gap. Now, we'll kind of transition talking a little bit about autofocus, but also as it comes to video performance. So some good news here. I showed you when I did the 56mm f1.2, when I did my focus pull test, it really was, it was kind of ugly. You could see very obvious stepping and pulsing, and there was a lot of noise involved. And so as you can see from this segment here for my basic focus pull test, it's vastly improved on that metric. What you can see also from the secondary clips doing the focus pull into the, in the snow towards the woods, you can see it handles, nice and smooth. And another clip here, we can see a focus pull at close focus distances on an orchid, and you can see that it's also handled pretty well. And so definitely an improvement when you're using autofocus. Now, when it comes to manual focus and focus by wire, Fuji does have one advantage in that they do offer the ability to, if you're in, your manual focus option, they do have the option to choose in the camera body whether to select a linear or a non-linear focus system, or focus emulation is maybe a more accurate way. Because all of this, of course, is taking input from the focus ring and routing it through focus motors. And so at least on Fuji, you do have options on how that's going to behave. There's some caveats there, though. First of all, if you're choosing nonlinear, the problem with nonlinear is that it is specific to the speed that you're entering in on the focus ring. So if you make a quick focus movement, it will make a more dramatic focus change. That can be useful, more useful if you're trying to make major focus changes. Challenge is, particularly for video, if you're looking for any kind of repeatability, you don't necessarily get repeatability unless you are just incredibly precise in how, quickly that you pull. So it's hard to say have a marker of I'm going to pull to this point and focus will be accurate. That's not always the case, and so repeatability is a problem when you're using nonlinear. There is also a problem, however, if you switch to linear, that while it behaves in a linear or consistent fashion, and so it's going to, react in the same way, the problem is that particularly when you're shooting video, if you're going to make a major focus pull, it takes a long time. And so in this video clip here they're showing, I wanted to do a nice, hopefully manual focus pull where I pulled through the layers of the falling snow to arrive at the woods. But the problem is that it's 3, 4, 5, 6 full rotations before I get there. And it's hard to do that smoothly. You can do a long focus pull somewhat smoothly, but then there's a pause as you move to do it again. And even if you're using some kind of focus lever, there is, often going to be an unnatural spot where you try to complete that revolution. And so bottom line is that if you want to do manual focus pulls, use a manual focus lens. This is not necessarily fantastic for that. There's one final thing that I do want to point to as a part of this review, just as more of a general observation. And it's true to this particular focal length and longer ones. This is probably pretty close to being the longest focal length that you've got on a Fuji system that is non-stabilized. And unfortunately, as I noted first of all in the focus section, I did see more motion blur than what I hoped to see in images where I thought I was at safe focus speeds, but due to fairly high pixel density on an X-T3 and a fairly long focal length, in this case, according to Fuji, it's 137 millimeters full frame equivalent. What that means is that it was just a little bit harder to always get a stable image out of that. And so that's one thing you're going to have to watch for. And certainly when shooting video, you basically are only going to be able to get video that is watchable if you're using a gimbal. As you can see from these couple of clips, I was actually using a monopod for this and doing my best to stabilize. And yet you can see every bit of movement is exaggerated by the longer focal length. And so unless you're shooting off of a gimbal or you're shooting off of a tripod, this is going to be a tough lens to use for picking up video footage. And and it's probably always going to be a bit long even for shooting handheld. But at the same time, I have used, for example, on a Sony body, I've used my Zeiss Milvus 135 millimeter f2 lens, shot video footage, and it's not stabilized tripod perfect, but the in-body image stabilization does produce usable footage in that situation. And so I do wish, because of that, since Fuji has not embraced a broad rollout of in-body image stabilization in their camera bodies, only one at this point is the HX1 is the only one that has utilize that to this point. I suspect there'll probably be more in the future, but this is probably a lens that could have benefited from having OS built into it. At the end of the day, however, while I have dealt with some negatives here, just for the sake of fairness, so you can make an informed decision, the reality is that a lot of what I've pointed to as a potential negative has as much to do with the system as it does with the lens, and probably more so. So the reality is that if you are a Fuji shooter and you are selecting a lens, particularly for portrait use inside of the the Fuji ecosystem, this is an excellent choice. It's got the weather sealing, it's got better autofocus. Obviously, there's obviously still some room for improvement there, particularly on the camera side for portrait use, but we're getting there, and this certainly has the potential to become even better as firmware and or new cameras improve the quality of focus in the focus system. And as far as the image quality goes, it delivers really, it delivers beautiful results with good detail, good color, and a little bit better autofocus. I think will help that to bring the very best out of that. I will say one final thing to help you maybe in making the decision, since I've most recently spent time with the 56 millimeter lens, which is about 84 millimeters in full frame equivalency. So basically we're talking 85 millimeters and 135 millimeters-ish, So there is a difference in kind of these two lenses. I actually personally kind of prefer the look of images out of 135 millimeter, particularly when you're talking about full body shots. I really love the kind of separation that such a lens gives, and it gives a really unique kind of look that I'm quite partial to. At the same time, however, you will find that it's surprising how long that focal length is when you're looking through the viewfinder if you've been shooting with other focal lengths and you throw that on, you'd be surprised at how tight the framing is. Byproduct of that is that it doesn't work in all situations. While I prefer the look of images from 135 millimeter, or equivalent focal length, 85 millimeter focal length is infinitely more flexible. You can use it better indoors. You can use it better for smaller groups. You actually need a pretty fair amount of working room to work with a 135 millimeter equivalent lens. So you just need to make sure to select the tool that suits your purpose. If you're shooting head and shoulders, no problem. If however, if you're wanting to shoot full body and you're working in a confined space, this is going to be too long for you, and so it works best, in my opinion, when you're shooting in outdoor environmental type portrait settings. I'm Dustin Abbott. I hope that this has helped you to draw some conclusions regarding this particular lens. And if you're looking for a good portrait lens and that focal length works for you, this obviously is one of the best options in the Fuji ecosystem for that. And it's fairly reasonably priced right now as of this review. I think there's a minor sale on it, but the price is somewhere under $900 US. And it's a thoroughly modern lens and offers, I think, a pretty strong value for that money. If you'll take a look in the description down below, I actually do have a full text review on this lens with lots of image samples. There is an image gallery, so you can see more of these photos and take a longer look at them if you would like. There's also buying links if you'd like to purchase one for yourself, and linkage to follow me on social media, to become a patron or sign up for my newsletter. And if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.